Austria boasts many famous composers. Two of them best represent the perfection of the classical era in music, Haydn and Mozart, Mozart and Haydn. Because of their adulation of one another, they would both have been honored to have been mentioned in the same breath. Mozart the sprinter, starting his adult life as a small child, a prodigy, and ending it sadly just as maturity was beginning to take hold. Haydn, the marathon man, with a premonition of longevity, never in a hurry for the limelight because, there was always time enough for that, and was not the limelight as ephemeral as a candle flame in any case. They are both displayed on equal terms at the base of the statue of the Empress Maria Theresia in Vienna. The empire regarded them as jewels of complementary value. The man perhaps old before his time, and the youth adolescent to the end. Mozart lived by his wits in such an uncertain atmosphere and died submerged in debt, as befitted one whose entire life was a gamble, the only certainty being his genius. Haydn, by contrast, rarely took a risk where this could be avoided, apart from his marriage, but that is a story we'll come to eventually. As I said, he was in no hurry. He made the best of a bad job, of many bad jobs, in fact, by outlasting all the disadvantages, swallowing his pride until it became an acquired taste, and keeping his own counsel in the well-ventilated living room of his mind. Not wealthy, better than wealthy, cozier than wealthy, well off. Papa Haydn, he was called, even by those who did not know him. It was a term of respect, verging on reverence. It is a sterile critical sport to try to define the undefinable or to list composers in order of achievement. Greatness has its own indecipherable rules which reveal themselves only by results over the years, accorded to some, denied to others. Haydn belongs to the short list of great composers. That much is sure, and is it not enough? Haydn, the symphonist, wrote over 100 and honed them into the tight, dramatic, logical form, accepted as a model by Beethoven and Brahms in years to come. Haydn, the composer of chamber music. He has been called the father of the string quartet, and his inventory boasted nearly 80 of them. Haydn, the composer for solo instruments. His delight were strings, but he composed works for all manner of instruments, reaching the limits of virtuosity with his fabulous trumpet concerto. Haydn, the humanist. To him, wit and humor were never incompatible with the deepest purpose. Haydn, the composer for the voice. Even if his orchestral works are the backbone of his enormous output, nowhere did his genius attain such heights as in the great oratorios written in the evening of his life. In The Creation, Haydn proclaims his own profound belief. The heavens are telling the glory of God.
Die Nacht, die verschwand, der folgenden Nacht. Die Nacht, die verschwand, der folgenden Nacht.
Haydn wrote The Creation in his late 60s. What God managed in 7 days, Haydn reflected in just under 2 hours, imbued with monumental vision and the requisite childlike innocence before the emerging wonders of the universe. Haydn's inspiration is unique in that it, like the man himself, was without any arrogance or pretension. He was curiously unsentimental and avowedly pragmatic, never having commissioned a portrait of himself, for instance. All I require, he used to say, is a carefree old age, a comfortable life, 4 meals a day, 4, a glass of good wine. He added grace and wit to all he did, and now, 200 years after his death, the places he worked in, the houses in which he lived, and his tomb have become places of pilgrimage for all lovers of music. There was nothing in his humble origins to make his task easier. His birthplace, although rebuilt later, preserves the flavor of his childhood. Nowadays, only tourist coaches stop in Rora, a small village where Haydn was born in 1732. It is 30 miles east of Vienna. Young Haydn, the second of 12 children born to a master wheelwright and his wife, never went hungry as a child, although his father found it pretty hard to make ends meet. Theirs was a sober and sensible home in which industry and simplicity were much appreciated. The master wheelwright couldn't read a note of music, but going on the assumption that the best things in life are free, he enjoyed playing the harp by ear and singing, encouraging his second child to join in with his unbroken voice of extraordinary clarity. Since Rorau is situated only about 12 miles from what is today Slovakia, and Hungary is just as close, it follows that music of various ethnic origins was heard as the peasantry worked in the fields. And these diverse strands entered young Haydn's consciousness to surface repeatedly in his music throughout his long life. Late in life, there were the sounds of gypsy fiddles in the Hungarian rondo with which he concluded a piano trio. And there is surely the rhythm of folk dancing in the finale of the piano concerto composed when he was in his 50s. The castle still stands in Rorau today. Haydn's mother had worked there as a cook. The Austro-Hungarian society was rigidly structured, with the wealthy aristocracy and the middle class enjoying their respective privileges with evident enjoyment, while the peasants kept their clearly defined distance without a murmur of dissent. People, in other words, knew their station. But within this structure, Haydn's family life was a happy one, with neighbors fraternizing and helping each other, and deep faith providing for spiritual comfort. Haydn's father erected a votive statue outside the parish church here, and the son remembered to make provision for its upkeep in his will. Music, of course, was associated with religion, and young Haydn's natural gift was praised by all and sundry. What a wonderful voice, yes. What a sense of rhythm here. Oh, what a musical ear. A visiting relative went as far as to suggest that young Haydn should move to the town of Hainburg towards Slovakia, where he could receive a musical education. The parents were enthusiastic. A musical education. What a wonderful stepping stone to a career in the church. But he was only 6 years old. Didn't seem to be an obstacle. Haydn later said that he learnt many things in Hainburg, including reading and writing, catechism, of course, and almost all string and wind instruments, as well as the timpani. But, he added, in the process I received more thrashings than food. It was evidently not the way to convince the boy that he had a religious vocation. It was not long before his voice was discovered by the master of the famous Vienna boys' choir, Herr Reuter, who offered Joseph room, board, education, and the exciting prospect of singing in St. Stephen's Cathedral, the greatest church in Austria. "We need new blood," pleaded Reuter. Well, his offer was accepted joyfully by Haydn's family. Little did they know that their son Joseph would never come home again. Reuter promised much more than he intended to deliver. He was not only extremely distinguished, but mean and lazy as well. The choir boys of St. Stephen's were inadequately fed, and their studies were neglected. He assigned older boys to teach the newcomers, resulting in less than adequate instruction, with the all-important subjects of theory and composition disregarded entirely. "I never had a proper teacher," Haydn used to say. "All I learnt was through attentive observation." He tried his hand at writing vocal music in 12 parts before he had learned the art of writing it in 2 parts. "I composed works that no instrument or throat could execute," he used to say with ironic satisfaction. The earliest work of his that survives is the Missa Brevis. As far as food was concerned, Joseph soon discovered that the only decent meals were served at outside functions, and from that moment on he maneuvered to be assigned to every wedding, funeral, and social event in Vienna. That was not hard to arrange, since his voice was exceptional. The boy treble Joseph Haydn was in demand. Well, this happy state of affairs lasted for a few years, but there was no way of changing the course of nature. Haydn was growing older, so was his voice. Oh, those uncontrollable yodels infiltrating the crystalline treble voice at the least expected moments. Even the Empress Maria Theresia began to take notice. "Do I have to listen to those squeaks?" she grumbled. "This boy doesn't sing, he croaks. Change him!" Well, how about his younger brother, Your Majesty? He too is talented. And so the solo roles were given to Michael Haydn, who had just joined the boys' choir shortly before. Reuter hastened to save his valuable young singer from the disgrace of sudden rejection. After all, there was still money to be made for all concerned. Castrati singers were in great demand. How about a small operation? "I humbly request permission to turn your son Joseph into a permanent soprano." Haydn's father rushed to Vienna in dismay. Whew, how relieved he was to find his son intact. With his boyish voice gone forever, Haydn was of no more use to Reuter. And when young Joseph couldn't resist the temptation of chopping off the pigtail of another chorister sitting in front of him, Reuter used this childish prank as an excuse to expel him. Into the streets of Vienna without a penny in his pocket, and without the kind of education which could have secured him a livelihood. The years of hardship had begun. Late in his life, Haydn wrote a set of variations for the piano in a minor key. No other work of his captures better the melancholy of his first year in Vienna alone. These variations herald the works of Schubert, another poet of introspection, of Viennese introspection. How old was Haydn at the time? 16, perhaps 17. Isolated in a big city, not celebrated for its humanity, and with only moral support from his family. The only man who offered him shelter was a singer named Spangler, a musician almost as destitute as Haydn himself, who shared a small lodging with a wife and a baby. A miserable space in the attic without a stove was reserved for Haydn. Oh, he was most grateful. Kind people lent him some clothing after his own belongings had been stolen. In 18th century Vienna, a musician was as reliant upon his appearance as upon his talent. In the center of Vienna today is the vast Hofburg, the imperial palace of the Habsburgs. Opposite it, by the coal market, standing as it did in Haydn's day, the Baroque St. Michael's Church. And beside the church, the so-called Michael House, now one of the many Haydn shrines in Austria. It was here that his fortunes changed. The kind-hearted Spangler, with another baby on the way, couldn't extend his hospitality further, and Haydn found similar accommodation to rent here, from attic to attic. The Michael House was a place of residence for many well-known artists, such as the court poet Metastasio, who introduced Haydn to the famous Italian composer and singing teacher Nicola Porpora, who was destined to play a major role in Haydn's future career. A good first contact was the noble Spanish family who guaranteed him free meals in exchange for a few keyboard lessons to their daughter Marianne, aged 9. No, try again. His intellectual satisfaction was assured as well when he discovered a book of clavier sonatas by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. They were like unsuspected treasure. He learned them all by heart, despite his more mundane duties, and they were the key to his mastery of classical style. Meanwhile, his physical survival was as important to his well-being as ever, and he secured it by joining a group of string players who were for hire, serenading under balconies, in the pay of optimistic seducers who could afford such luxuries. As soon as the introduction had been made, Haydn became valet to his neighbor Porpora. This singing teacher was a hot-tempered man and a composer of note. Haydn was only too happy to clean Porpora's shoes in exchange for learning the basics of composition and the more robust elements of the Italian language. And soon Porpora took him along to soirees in the homes of local noblemen, where Haydn accompanied his master on the keyboard and started to make a small name for himself. In Weinzierl Castle in Lower Austria, his host Baron Fürnberg had a problem. My dear Haydn, he confided, as you know, the fashion is for friends of a certain class to play duets or trios. Now, I've committed the indiscretion of inviting 4 guests, each with their own instrument. Could you think of a little something appropriate for the occasion? Oh, I have the very thing. This seemingly innocent expression of local megalomania made history, since it witnessed the birth of the first string quartet, a form Haydn had been toying with in any case, and now felt free to elevate it to such heights that the art form is still very much alive today, all thanks to Fürnberg's dilemma. It was Count Morzin of Vienna who offered Haydn his first position as Kapellmeister, and not a moment too soon. For Haydn urgently needed a steady income. He was in love with one of his pupils, but she, unfortunately, was destined for a convent. As a man of duty, he composed an organ concerto to send her on her way, and faute mieux, as the French say, proceeded to marry her sister. It's hard to understand why such an intrinsically cautious man should have rushed into such an irrevocable act. Was he just ready for marriage regardless of any other consideration? He himself delighted in explaining his confusion when Countess Morzin, his patron's beautiful wife, leant over the keyboard when he was playing, and her neckerchief worked loose to such an extent that Haydn's playing faltered and his fingers became glued to the keyboard. The description is Haydn's own, but the wife he took had few of such delights to offer. A compassionate judge might find the abuse which has been heaped onto her by biographers and historians to be excessive. Suffice it to say that she used his manuscripts as linings for her pastry tins and hair curlers. Curious why both Haydn and Mozart loved one sister and married the other. But what evaded him in personal happiness was largely compensated for by professional success. And when Count Morzin squandered his fortune and was forced to disband his orchestra, Haydn found himself employed by no less than Prince Paul Esterhazy, a man whose taste and fortune enabled him to provide the composer with the best musical appointment in Europe. Next to the Austrian royal family, the Hungarian clan of the Esterhazys was the richest and most powerful dynasty in the Habsburg Empire. They began as barons and moved their way up to princes, expanding their empire through clever marriages and political intrigues. And by the mid-18th century, they owned over 1 million acres of land and, more than sufficient castles. The princes were known for their extravagant lifestyle, and even Goethe, otherwise never at a loss for words, chose to describe such splendor simply as Esterhazy. Haydn was to work for the Esterhazys for the next 30 years, initially at the court in Eisenstadt, 30 miles south of Vienna. At last, he had an orchestra of first-rate musicians to play his music. The prince and his brother, who took over after his death, were the best employers one could hope to have at the time, and Haydn's work contract with them was adequate by the standards of the period. But from our perspective, it would seem that Haydn did the job of 4 men for the salary of 1. The contract specified that Haydn was to be at the prince's disposal morning, noon, and night, and never travel without permission. Each day at noon, he would receive the prince's musical list of requests, and by the evening, he was to be prepared to perform the selected works. He would regularly compose new works of music for all existing ensembles, and all his new compositions would become the sole property of the prince. He would train the orchestra and the singers, administer the opera house, conduct all performances from the harpsichord. He would tune the instruments and see to it that the attire of the musicians would include white silk stockings, white linen, that they be powdered, either with pigtails or hair bags, but otherwise to be of identical appearance. He was expected to conduct himself in an exemplary fashion before the orchestra, abstaining from undue familiarity with them, from eating or drinking with them, or from other intercourse with them. And this is a contract of which every other musician in Austria was jealous. And when, after 2 years, Prince Paul died and was succeeded by his young brother Nicholas, Haydn's duties became even more onerous, for his new master was himself a musician. He played the baritone, a popular instrument of the time. It had 2 sets of strings, one of which could be bowed or plucked in the usual way, and a second set underneath which could be reverberated by being plucked with the thumb behind the fingerboard. On the orders of his master, Haydn composed no less than 175 works for this curious instrument. Soon, Prince Nicholas decided to build the fabulous palace. In Fertőd in Hungary, 20 miles south of Eisenstadt. It has been rightly called the Hungarian Versailles. The palace has survived world wars and changing political regimes, and it has in recent years been restored to much of its glory. Inside, the letters exquisitely painted on the ceiling remind us that the builder was Haydn's patron, Prince Nicholas Esterházy. And many of the mere 126 rooms are painted and gilded and furnished the way they were when Haydn walked these corridors 200 years ago. Guests of the prince would arrive in the Sala Terrena before moving up the stairs to what Prince Nicholas had decreed should be the focal point of the whole edifice. Over the years, many of Haydn's greatest works received their first performance in the concert hall of the Esterházy Palace. Unfortunately, however, at the Summer Palace in Esterhazy, there was not enough space to accommodate the orchestra musicians' families. Wives and children stayed north in Eisenstadt, eagerly awaiting the yearly leave of their menfolk. And what a calamity befell the orchestra when the prince decided one day, for reasons of his own, to postpone their home leave. In the absence of unions and the notion of work ethics for servants of the court, there was no way to protest. But Haydn, ever resourceful when it came to the defense of his musicians, invented a new tool for confrontation with the nobility, the tool of musical wit. He presented a new symphony. The last movement started presto. But then the jolly mood suddenly changed. Adagio. Without warning, the first oboe and a horn player stopped playing, blew out their candles, left. "11 bars later, the bassoonist promptly walked away. Then the remaining horn, the oboe. Several bars after that, the cellist and the double bass followed them. Then even the violins started to move off. Finally, only 2 violins were left as an echo of the absent symphony. I see what you mean, said the prince at long last. You're dropping a hint, are you not? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I suspect that the musicians want to see their families. Of course. How foolish of me. They can pack up tomorrow. Very foolish of me. Haydn put his career on the line with the Farewell Symphony in 1772. But he was to stay at Esterházy for another 20 years, never needing to drop a hint quite as broad again.